Spoiler alert for the following programs. I will be discussing these throughout the episode at multiple different times, so if you don't want spoilers, I would wait to watch this until you've seen everything on this list. Or unless someone watches it for you and tells you what parts you can watch. The villains have our heroes cornered. The powerhouse has been defeated and there's no one to help them as the big bad creeps closer. What shall they do? What's this? Our favorite silly protagonist, the only one the villains never considered as a threat, has become competent? And they're still cracking jokes? A CMHB is literally a crouching moron hidden badass. The name says a lot. What it doesn't say is that these are often some of the most favorite characters by writers and audiences alike, and they can add great dynamics to your stories. And the introduction I just gave is not how they all turn out. As the name implies, a CMHB is a character who, outside of danger, is kind of considered a moron by the other characters. But underneath all that, they're really tough, either with cool powers or expert hand-to-hand combat. CMHBs are basically tailor-made to be liked because they are written to be funny and they are written to be awesome, and people like that combination, especially in one character. With well-written CMHBs, there's a certain charisma to them that many people are attracted to. But that begs the question, what makes a good CMHB? One of the most important aspects of the CMHB is that they're really like that. They're not playing dumb to disguise their badassery, they really do act like an adult child most of the time. This is something that separates them from other tropes like faking idiocy. The moron and the badass can shine through in different ways, which brings me to the ways to be a CMHB. Some CMHBs are goofy because they want to be, or they're covering for themselves in a way by downplaying their badass side. But in a fight, they're extremely competent, maybe even more so than some of the other characters who are badass the majority of the time. This version typically comes with some tragic or semi-depressing backstory for how they're so skilled, why they want to see the brighter side of things, maybe if they're more of a pacifist, etc. How goofy they are and what form the crouching moron can take varies depending on your preference. They can be naturally optimistic, cracking jokes at every opportunity, or pretending to be a fool. Faking idiocy, like I mentioned earlier, is something else entirely, so try not to mistake someone like, say, Uncle Iroh for someone like the Flash of DC Comics. Leaning more towards the moron side of things, some CMHBs are goofy even while in serious situations. Most of the time a quippy superhero or detective, they can be considered a man-child in a cast of more serious characters, and they are inevitably the odd one out of the group, but still incredibly lovable as long as they don't get annoying. More on that later. Spider-Man, Flash, Jake Peralta, the list goes on. The most hard-hitting factor of this CMHB is when they finally shut up and get serious. The whole tone of a scene can shift depending on this CMHB's attitude, especially if they're the lead. Almost entirely on the moron side, some CMHBs are just genuinely goofy, and not always in a convenient way like the superhero variants. This is a genuinely idiotic or just comedic character who is really good at a select few things, or gets serious in very few situations. Outside of those few situations, they are almost pure comic relief. I'm not a huge fan of this one personally because comedy relief and gag characters are not my favorite most of the time, and these CMHBs spend the majority of their screen time being that over badass. But there's still value in this type of CMHB, especially if there's a cool reveal where they see someone they care about in trouble and instantly kick into serious mode, shocking the villain and beating the crap out of him. These CMHBs often have value in the very shocking reveals of their badassery and the addition of a mostly comedic character if you need a little light in the story. Just watch out for the setting they're in, because putting them in the wrong one can make them seem very annoying and out of place. Then there's the CMHBs who don't realize they're badasses. They're normally a more naive or untrained protagonist, or someone who's used to being in the background or messing things up. Sometimes the cause of the doubt is the comparison to other more openly badass characters in the story. Think Po from Kung Fu Panda. In his case, he has the raw talent like the others, but lacks the training and, in some areas, the maturity and the confidence that could allow him to be badass. By the end of the movie, he gains all of these things, and uses them to become a great warrior like the others. Some characters are just generally more clumsy characters. They don't have the opportunity to be badass due to a lack of experience, constant surprises, or just generally being underestimated by their own allies. I wouldn't necessarily call her a CMHB most of the time, but in Dory's case, she really does try to be helpful, and she has useful skills. But her memory often fails her, and in the first movie, it causes Marlon to lose faith in her, albeit temporarily. A lot of these stories tend to have plots with the CMHB earning their stripes and proving they're capable. Now, there's a certain kind of CMHB that can be openly badass and still be somewhat hidden, the second fiddle. Most of the time, these characters are lancers, having some sort of rivalry with the main protagonist. Typically played for comedy, the main character is the most powerful, and their lancer is almost as powerful, but only almost, and it's made fairly clear. Maybe they're even constantly challenging the hero and getting beat up as a result. Or they challenge a villain and get the crap beat out of them before the main hero comes in and takes them down in a moment of chosen oneness. But when they aren't pitted against the main protagonist, they're actually awesome. It takes a focus episode to really see how tough they are, but it's worth the wait to see this character in action. This is probably one of my favorites because I love hidden badass reveals, and the ones where everyone is surprised except for the main character going, "That's my pal," or even, "I didn't know they could do that," is nice. There is one final CMHB type that isn't as common and I personally don't find very interesting, and that is the split personality CMHB. One side is just generally an idiot and has no knowledge of the badass side existing, and in a moment of crisis it comes out and kicks butt, often with a questionable moral compass for some added flavor. More common in animes, as far as I've noticed, these CMHBs are two completely different characters sharing a body, often as a result of amnesia or trauma or something. I wouldn't say this applies to every split personality character because sometimes they can be very interesting, but when it comes to a CMHB who is a CMHB through a split personality, this often leads to two uninteresting or only semi-interesting characters rather than one compelling character. Not to mention having to explain how the personalities formed, remain separate, and don't interfere with each other every 5 seconds. The reason I say that is because CMHBs have contrasting character traits, which is why when they're well written and well balanced, they're so cool to watch or read about. Instead of one idiot and one badass, two debatable characters on their own who don't appeal to every audience, you get one character with both traits who tends to appeal to everyone. Having them in the same character but not allowing any overlap can lead to problems like the idiot character causing problems the badass side has to fix later, which can have merit, but it often ends up annoying because you wonder how the badass let that happen in the first place. This goes for all CMHBs actually, since you have to be mindful of the two aspects of the character and how they would overlap. If you need an idiot to constantly cause problems, you should consider making them a separate character and not a CMHB. Now let's get into some examples and the majority of the spoilers. Here's one. Sean Spencer from Psych. Basically, the whole premise of the show is that Sean, raised primarily by his police officer father, is almost inhumanly observant and possesses incredible detective skills. But he doesn't actually want to be a detective. I think it's out of spite or something. He also is notably terrible at being an adult, in contrast to his hardworking, pretty good at being an adult best friend, Gus. Anyway, for complicated reasons, he fakes being a psychic and starts working as a private detective/psychic, mostly to help out the police department. He's a CMHB because he is such a goofy person that he'll do stupid stuff even in dangerous situations, although a lot of the time, that's also how he gets out of them. Along with his goofiness, he is still a really good detective, like Jake Peralta in Brooklyn Nine-Nine, although his moronitude and arrogance, and the fact that he's faking a psychic the whole time, does sometimes get in the way of it, which is why it takes the chief of police, 2 detectives, his retired police officer father, and his logical, business-minded best friend to keep him from getting killed or going completely broke more than once a season. But an interesting side to his CMHB-ness comes up when he faces off against serial killer and riddle maker Mr. Yang. As it slowly gets more dangerous and they are constantly outwitted, with some cast members actually dying, the stress and seriousness of the situation causes him to lose focus, and that's when we see that his goofy approach to everything is how he focuses, and is part of what makes him such a good detective. He can distract himself from the real stakes of the situation. His best friend, and also his foil, Gus, who I mentioned earlier, helps him by, whenever he freezes up, playing up his own goofy side, allowing Sean to refocus and figure out the riddles in time to save an innocent woman, his mom, and his then-girlfriend. As a bonus, simultaneously keeping his fake psychicness secret too. This version of a CMHB, in both Sean and Jake's cases, works because they are in shows that are detective dramas with comedy aspects and occasional seriousness. They don't feel out of place, and they don't really get annoying, although personally I do prefer Sean since the show is slightly more serious and less of a constant gag. That's just my opinion. One of everybody's favorite Marvel heroes, Spider-Man, is often a mix of the naive CMHB and the man-child CMHB. As everyone knows, he quips in life-threatening situations, most of the time narrates to his audience, has his fair share of trauma and tragedy, and is actually very powerful when you think about it, which is hard to notice sometimes. He's a teenager with personal problems, and is not always regarded as a good guy by the people of New York, but he really is tough when it comes down to it, and he can be serious. This is one of those cases where the moron side actually does cause problems the badass side has to fix, but the primarily difference here is that it makes sense and is in character. Throughout the first season of Ultimate Spider-Man, Peter and his friends, remember teenage superheroes, make impulsive moves, cause themselves and shield problems, and generally spend a nice fraction of the season cleaning up their own messes. The main difference here is that it never happened enough that it got annoying, and there was clearly character development after each incident. It happened less frequently throughout the later seasons, and Spider-Man clearly had a lot of character growth by the end, along with his allies. He stopped making a lot of those more impulsive moves because, 1, he got older, and 2, he learned. That was part of the whole point of the series. If your CMHB lets the moron side slip up a little too badly and then learns from it and does not repeat the mistake, it's not necessarily a bad thing to put in. Everybody makes mistakes, especially if they're learning, but if it happens over and over with no real consequences or lasting development, and it just feels like a gag, then it should be scrapped, or at least revised. I mentioned him briefly earlier, but Flash from the DCAU is a great example of a CMHB. Flash primarily appears in Justice League and Justice League Unlimited, and he is a definite man-child CMHB. He was written in contrast to the rest of the cast of more stoic badasses, who all love him and would probably murder anyone who ever hurt him. He's talkative, the most quippy of the Leaguers, very empathetic towards his friends and everyone in general, and of course, he's a bit of a man-child. Although when things get serious, he's amazing in a fight, because superheroes. A great part of the CMHB demonstrated through Flash's character in the DCAU is their frequent roles as the linchpin or heart of the cast. Multiple times throughout the franchise, Flash proves to be the glue that holds the League together and brings a little joy into their otherwise semi-depressing jobs. Now, remember how I said the League would probably want to murder anyone who ever hurt him? Yeah, well, I wasn't entirely kidding. In an early episode of the series, we see an alternate dimension where the Flash was killed by President Lex Luthor. Yes, President. So the entire League went crazy and Superman fully barbecues Luthor. It's a real eventful episode. Flash makes a couple jokes about being the conscience and heart of the group, especially after Luthor starts running for president in their universe in Justice League Unlimited to piss everybody off and recreate the circumstances of the Ultimate World to ruin the League's reputation. And it's kind of a ha-ha, we all as an audience love Flash, but until it's not a ha-ha, we as an audience all love Flash. Because in the Season 2 finale of Justice League Unlimited, we see the true power of a well-written CMHB, and it is a roller coaster. Flash throws a few quips around after Luthor and Brainiac do their weird fusion thing. Once again, very long story. And the League fights them, and unsurprisingly, there's a big pile of rubble by the end. The problem is, everything's destroyed, but the Luthor-Brainiac fusion is still kicking, and Flash is the only one left conscious and mostly unburied. Luthor gets ready to kill him, and for probably the first time in the franchise, Flash is scared. You can see it in his face. He manages to get free, and after Luthor asks him if he's really gonna fight him, Flash just turns and runs. No quips, no threats, no nothing. Luthor calms down and starts rebuilding the machine to destroy the world, like you do, before, out of nowhere, Flash comes around on the horizon and blindsides him really hard. He does it again and again, running around the world each time to gain speed, going faster than we've ever seen him go before until he's vibrated Luthor and Brainiac apart on a molecular level. It's a really good badass moment until he suddenly disappears into the Speed Force and Superman briefly considers murdering Luthor. He doesn't, which is all well and good, and there's this nice little morality moment until Jean goes, "Flash is alive!" and they pull him out of the Speed Force and give him a hug because you gave us a heart attack, man! Even Batman was freaking out. The whole point of that spiel is that in the episode, we get all of the most valuable reactions you can get from a CMHB. Ah, that's funny. Oh yeah, that's awesome. Oh geez, this is serious. Oh my god, what? Now, let's review some advantages of the CMHB, if you hadn't already picked up on it. There's a really valuable moment with every CMHB where they get serious. whether that means shutting up for the first time in their lives or really unleashing their full power in a fight. Going back to my lovely examples, if a supervillain ever threatens Aunt May, Spider-Man will briefly consider murder and up the violence factor. If somebody's about to destroy the world and there's no one else to help, Flash will run around the world hitting them until they cut it out. As I said in my very serious introduction, a CMHB often finds themselves underestimated and discounted as useless initially. Initially being the key word there. Having a CMHB pull a 180 on the villain's expectations has immense value because your audience will either be going, "Show 'em what you're made of," or "Wow, that was unexpected." That fight where they reveal their badassery and completely shock the villain can be so satisfying. Although I will say you have to have some kind of build-up or the badass part can seem really random and like it comes out of nowhere. That being said, I wouldn't exactly call that a hard rule. Like I mentioned with Flash, CMHBs are often the heart or linchpin and are well liked, whether openly or secretly, by most of the cast. They often have close or at least wholesome relationships with the other characters and can provide excellent contrast to more stoic characters. Again, like Flash with the Justice League in basically everything. Sometimes CMHBs can be good when their moronitude is a character flaw that they have to overcome over the course of the series. There is the risk of the CMHB becoming annoying, but it can have a lot of return if it's developed and not overplayed, like it was in Psych and the beginning of Ultimate Spider-Man. But that balance is hard to find, and it varies depending on the genre, setting, other characters, etc. I wouldn't go for this unless you were really sure about it, or it was a happy accident that you can just call intentional. A nice benefit of the CMHB is also how they fit into downtime compared to the straight badass characters. Straight badasses often feel more out of place in a calm, casual setting, typically called downtime, either because they're broody or more stoic, or you may have only really thought about them in an action setting, not a casual one. CMHBs have a set and ready personality for downtime that feels pretty natural. But, for the record, you can build a downtime attitude for a badass character that isn't a CMHB, broody, or stoic. This is just one way of doing that. Now, as much as I hate it, like with any trope, the CMHB has its limits and downsides. A problem arises when you have a CMHB who is too goofy. Yes, that is possible. What makes a character a CMHB is a delicate balance of the moron and the badass. The main rule to remember is that if their goofiness consistently gets in the way of them, say, fighting a supervillain, then that will get in the way of the appeal of the badass side of the character. Because the crouching moron only comes out in calm situations, when they are able to act like that, because that's how they want to act, they're aware of the consequences if they goof off at the wrong time. The badass side won't let the goofy side act like an idiot all the time. That's part of what makes them a badass. But the inverse of this problem can also be true. If after the reveal that this character is secretly a badass, they just stay that way, that's not a CMHB. That's a badass who had an act for a while. Not to mention, if the shift is too dramatic, the character may not be likable anymore, and will seem like a completely different person. When you have the reveal, you have to be able to maintain the core traits of the character. That is part of the appeal. Think about it in terms of what separates them from other types of characters. Funny guy characters can produce "that's funny" in their normal role and "oh no" when they finally stop laughing. Badass characters can produce "that's awesome" in their normal role and "oh no" when they lose. And the CMHB can produce all three of these situations, which is why I love them. But you may have to have those aspects throughout the story, or the CMHB loses its purpose and may even become annoying or too different. Something else that can lead to a CMHB getting annoying is if the bad guys consistently underestimate them, despite the badass side having come out multiple times before, which they definitely would have heard about. They don't have to drop the whole goofy aspect, in fact they specifically shouldn't, but they should be taken seriously at a certain point, even when they haven't directly encountered the bad guys. Personally, I don't think it's too much of a stretch if the bad guys are maybe a little confused or not used to fighting this butt-kicking embodiment of sunshine, but they definitely shouldn't all have that "I can't believe everyone's so afraid of you" line, because it gets old. They also should only be surprised the first time. After that, it's essentially a normal fight, but with quips. Before I wrap this up, I want to discuss one last detail, because I know you're kind of dying for me to end this video. What makes the CMHB a badass? Think about what makes this character fit into the badass category, and how it might contribute to the story, and potentially fit into their backstory or personality. It could be a surprising amount of competence at leadership, a sudden power boost in moments of dire need, alien or other fantastical ancestry, incredible martial arts, the list goes on. Pretty much anything, really, as long as it isn't too far-flung from your established character and reality. I would like to say that while badass implies someone with fighting capabilities, there are characters who are badass with more specialized skills. Thinking back to Dory and her ability to read human writing, which helps them find Nemo. A useful, plot-relevant skill that the rest of the cast doesn't have can make a character a CMHB, just a different type of CMHB because they aren't necessarily a badass on the battlefield, if there even is a battlefield in your story. Those are my thoughts on it anyway. And that's it! CMHBs are awesome! This video was really long, so if you made it through, congrats! Have a nice life, and be on the lookout for the next one.